Good afternoon, Matt. Thanks so much again for having me on the program, on the webinar here today. I'm really very excited to be here. I feel very honored to be able to speak today, and I hope to contribute some value for my fellow historians and educators. Last time we spoke, I brought up the idea of the genesis and the telos, the origin and end goal of history, and tried to coax out the various implications derived from three words for history in Greek: historia, singgraphe, and logos. At the end of that discussion, as you might recall, we found that the study of history is ultimately focused on the liberation of the individual from the tyranny of the now, drawing them out of their own myopic worldview in order that they might know and love themselves and know, love, and serve God Himself. I thought a beneficial topic today would be the question of what skills help bring our students towards such an end goal. What skills lead them to become better historians? What skills lead them to become better caretakers of their own heritage, or better observers of the inevitable repeating patterns in life, and ultimately better servants of God, the patterner Himself? This discussion, therefore, will move from a theoretical to a practical stance, beginning with some ideas about what skills are necessary and how they contribute to our ultimate goal, but finishing with some practical suggestions about how to implement these skills at different grade levels. Every discipline involves a certain number of abilities or skill sets which are inculcated during the course of study and cultivated over time. As a student becomes involved in a discipline, they acquire these skills and hone them through constant reiteration and practice. The acquisition of such skills leads through stages to eventual mastery of the subject. This acquisition was divided by the medieval guilds into a four-stage journey. There was the novice, who is unconscious and incompetent; the initiate, who is conscious but incompetent; the journeyman, or proficient, who is conscious and competent; and the master, who is consciously competent. Thus, every student begins neither knowing the craft nor knowing that they don't know. As they are introduced to the study, they realize what they don't know, and though they lack skill in the discipline, they do their best to begin to improve. With time and effort, the student becomes aware of what they do and do not know, but they also have acquired a sufficient amount of knowledge and skill to be competent in the craft, so much so that they can eventually teach others. Finally, the student achieves a level of competency that the skill emerges from them without thinking. They no longer know that they are doing the craft, but merely do the craft as though they were breathing. With history, we're at something of an advantage in that history is all around us, as our attachment to history is very strong. Stories and movies and music, images in our culture all have references to history which can aid a student and a teacher in learning. If they do not know details about World War II, for instance, they may at least have played with G.I. Joe or Plastic Soldiers, or know about the video games Call of Duty or Medal of Honor, or seen movies like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or The Iron Giant, or The Sands of Iwo Jima, or later on in their young adulthood, Saving Private Ryan or Hacksaw Ridge. Parents tell family stories, or they read to their children and again expose them to history. Language itself, as J.R.R. Tolkien points out, is a form of history, since every word we say has historical background to it. We cannot speak or write, therefore, without some exposure to history. You walk into a Starbucks coffee shop, for instance, and the name over the doorway, it refers to a character in the novel written in 1851 by Herman Melville, Moby Dick. That name of the character, Starbuck, is in turn connected to words in German and Old Norse and Latin and Greek and Sanskrit. Stjarnaböcker, or Stella Bach. Consequently, the attachment to history is not as foreign as, say, an attachment to learning another language like Urdu. When you look at the various lists of skills, however, it would seem that this ability to do history is very foreign indeed. There are great websites to visit to see lists of skills that need to be known. I'd encourage you to visit there if you can. The National Historical Education Clearinghouse lists 5 skills to be cultivated in a student. The Historical Thinking Project lists 6. The American Historical Association lists 9. UCLA lists 35 under 5 headers. If you ever look at the education standards for your state, you'll probably find a list as long as your arm. And all this seems far too much to pin on a 3rd grader learning history or on a teacher trying to pass history on to a young person. In fact, most of the time it seems teachers of history excel more in turning students away from history rather than bringing them to mastery. History ought to be taught, especially to the novice, as a rollicking story or a game. It's most interesting when it is seen as a form of play, ludus in Latin, or as an exciting story. Dates, names, places, events, they're all important to learn, it's true, but their greatest importance lies for the young adult, the young student, in learning the game of history. Why, for instance, is this fellow on horseback? He certainly seems proud, even noble. Yet who is the fellow in red, seated on a throne? Is that Caesar? Is the other fellow a Roman? Or a barbarian? What is he gesturing towards? Is it a slave? Is it the weapons at his feet? Look at all those banners. And the men in armor. Is the man on horseback surrendering or demanding something? Does Caesar look pleased or angry? And why does the fellow on the left look so shocked and dismayed? Young people normally respond well and are eager to engage in questions of this nature when presented with an image or an artifact to consider, rather than being inundated with numerous skills to learn and dates and names to memorize and tasks to do. Therefore, in younger years, and indeed even up into the years of the apprentice and the journeyman, it's best to limit our teaching of history to focus on the cultivation of a few major skills, or senses of history, which draw them into this game. Now, I list them as the following. There's the sense of character, the sense of cause and effect, the sense of chronology, the sense of geography, the sense of historical empathy, and the sense of overall dramatic story. I want to touch on each one of these just briefly. According to the ancient Greek writer Plutarch, true history is a study of great leaders and innovators. It is not history as I am writing, Plutarch insisted, but lives, and in the most glorious deeds, there is not always an indication of virtue or vice. Indeed, a small thing, like a phrase or a jest, often makes a great revelation of a character, more than battles where thousands die. When we try to inculcate in students this sense of character, we try to draw them into the idea that primarily history is a study of human beings in the world. Men, women, children, making their way the best they can. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "There is properly no history, only biography." As the end goal, or telos, is to help young people know themselves, in Greek, nothe seauton, teaching character in history becomes a vital tool. It allows a novice to consider the greatness or failure of another person and to emulate the great aspects as they see in those people and to shun the objectionable. It provides insight into motive as well and gives example of how to overcome hardship and offers evidence of the greatness or depravity of which we are capable as human beings. How often we hear students say, "I like this character," or "I don't like this character." Their likes and dislikes become better trained as they study more people in history and learn of their situations and decisions. To this end, the teacher can offer first-hand accounts of events to students. Biographies are a great possibility, as are several fictional accounts of non-fiction characters. For instance, Laura Ingalls Wilder's first-hand accounts, The Long Winter and The House on Plum Creek, Little House on the Prairie. Those are excellent. But so too are D'Aulaire's stories of Washington, or the stories of Caddy Woodlawn, or Collier and Collier's My Brother Sam is Dead. Practically speaking, names are just names unless you begin to probe into the character of the person. Reading Robert Bolt's play A Man for All Seasons, for instance, grants insight not only to Thomas More, but into Henry VIII, and Cardinal Wolsey, and Richard Rich, and all the characters that suffered through that era of history. We only begin to know Thomas More when we experience that play and ask questions about it, like why did Thomas More resist the king? What did Thomas More like or dislike in his private life? Or what situation was he dealing with? Could we have done it differently? We have to allow students, especially younger ones, to roam freely on this topic of character, not to hold them to rigid research or specific standards for a project. We can assign them different ways to discover character, create a fictional work set in the same time period, or make an outline or a small project of the character from history, or propose alternate yet plausible responses to the same problem that the character faces. Make a first-person account of some event based on this character's perspective, or construct a fictional diary that this character may have kept. But ultimately, the goal is to bring them to a better understanding of the character of the person, not just to meet research criteria. The second sense, that of cause and effect, is similar to what Isaac Newton wrote about physics. He wrote that in the third law of physics, that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. That statement means that in every interaction there is a pair of forces acting on the two interacting objects. The size of the forces in the first object equals the size of the force in the second object. In history it's a bit more complex, but a similar idea applies. Every event in history is the result, the effect, of a cause or series of causes. In his great video series Connections, Dr. James Burke brings this idea to life. What we have now, our political situation or our social situation, or even the food that we eat or our entertainment, the very objects that surround us, are all the results of a series of causes which we only dimly perceive. When we study history, therefore, we shouldn't simply list one thing after another, as though they were distinct and discrete events. Rather, we have to prompt students to ask the question, how did this event here lead to this other event here? How, for instance, did the crisis of increased financial strain lead to the eventual collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century? How did the collapse of the empire lead to a period of darkness and chaos in Europe, known as the Dark Ages? How did the darkness and chaos in Europe lead to the rise of the Frankish kingdom under Charlemagne in the 9th century? Asking those sorts of questions prompts students to begin seeing history not as one darn thing after another, as historian Arnold Toynbee coined, but as an interconnected web of events influencing each other. This broadens their perception, and it sets them on the road to being able to see their own situation in a more extended light. A practical exercise with students may be to create a visual web of such influences. I had a colleague who set this as a project with students using clippings and photographs that they were to connect with yarn to illustrate just such a web of cause and effect. Another project may simply be to bring in an ordinary daily object, one that they may be familiar with, and begin asking them what the origin of that might be. Have they ever thought where that came from? I remember one time a history professor of mine brought in French fries from McDonald's for the class. And he began asking questions about where these French fries came while we munched away. And French fries, the potato, why did it become a staple food in America? And before that, why did it become a staple food in Europe? And did we know that it was banned by the church at one point in Europe? Did we know that it came originally from South America? Did we know that it caused the destruction of the population in Ireland in the 19th and early 20th century? That sort of set us off to thinking about the cause and effect of the very thing that we were eating right in front of us. Now, a third sense that we need to cultivate is a sense of chronology. Seller and Yateman, who wrote the famous history comedy text of 1066 and all that, they wrote, history is not what you thought, it's what you remember. All other history defeats itself. Seller and Yateman's text is a raucous bit of humor and is enhanced by knowing history. One's sense of chronology, the sense of events and how they happen in relation to each other, enhances our memory and provides a context for knowing history. Now, sadly, chronology, or more accurately, dates themselves, which is most readily emphasized by most history teachers, is at the expense of all other aspects of the study. True, dates are important, but we have to be careful not to create a blizzard of dates that buries the novice and creates a hatred of history. A good way to avoid this is to insist on a small number of key dates around which all others can flurry. Sometimes it's helpful to take a line and divide it into two parts and set a date right in the middle. So between now and the year 0, for instance, a date of 1066 might be right in the middle. So 1,000 years on one side and 1,000 on the other. And it creates a timeline of 2,000 years, which you can kind of get your mind around. Or you might set 5 dates, because children normally have 5 fingers, and you set 5 dates that they have to know. These are the key dates, and these other dates are kind of secondary. And that way you limit yourself to the number of dates the child is actually having to learn. Creating timelines is a great way to construct this sense of chronology. The framework or timeline of dates can increase as the novice progresses in historical study until they can flesh out minute chronological detail, but remain clear as teacher which dates are imperative to know and which are secondary in this specific year, rather than insisting that every single date is important. Practically speaking, for instance, with the 3rd or 4th graders studying the ancient world, insisting that 1200 BC be remembered is an easy thing to do. Daily reiteration or query about this date can fix the Bronze Age collapse in the mind of most 9 or 10-year-olds. Every day you come in and you say, 1200 BC, what happened? And they respond, the Bronze Age collapse. Or you say, the Bronze Age collapse, when was it? Pick a student. 1200 BC. That, in comparison to remembering really minute detail, is a lot easier. Students in 9 or 10-year-olds will have a hard time remembering, like, the Hyksos invasion started somewhere around 1640 BC, when the authority of the 14th dynasty in the Nile Delta and the 13th dynasty in Upper Egypt had been weakened, etc., etc., etc. That's too much for them. But it may be easier for them to remember the smaller number of dates and have that as the key thing they can latch onto. If you inundate them with a ton of dates, it's that sort of blizzard that drives young scholars away from enjoying history. Though they may not appreciate all the nuances of history at first, one day they might. And giving them a small number of dates to commit to memory allows them the opportunity to set other dates in place and gain a sense of the chronology of events in human history. Now that leads to the next sense to cultivate, which is the sense of geography. The term geography, geographia, was coined by an historian, Eratosthenes, in the 2nd century BC. It literally means a writing of, graphia, or mapping of, the earth, geo. Similar word geometry comes from that, the measure of the earth. Geography is frequently considered the mother of all sciences because it was probably the first knowledge or science that primitive cultures developed, if we can use that term, primitive cultures. Our perception immediately forms in 4 directions, north, south, east, west, the 4 corners of the world. Thus, geography, like mathematics, is also a concrete subject which can't be denied easily. That is, to have an opinion about geography, whether Annapurna Massive is in Nepal or Brazil, just isn't possible. To deny that the Mississippi River, for instance, flows south through America is not really possible. You could have ignorance of it, But you can't have an opinion and say, no, I think that the pyramids actually are in Canada. That's not possible. We're tied to the land by our physical being. We're tied to the facts of geography as though we're nailed to a wooden scaffold. Learning geography then forces the young mind to grapple with certain inescapable realities. It also creates in them a sense of their own location in the midst of those realities. Geography explains how and why most events occurred in history as well. What geographical element, for instance, helped create the wealth of the Byzantine Empire? Was it mountains everywhere? Was it rivers? Or was it these large bodies of water that allowed them to do shipping everywhere? Why does the Muslim conquest of Africa and Europe mirror the extent of the Byzantine Empire? Why, for instance, don't the Muslims spread south into Africa or spread down towards the southeast? Is it because there's this massive desert down there that blocks travel? How did the Muslim Umayyads sweep so easily into Iberia, Spain in 711? If you look at the connection between Spain and Africa, very close to each other there at Gibraltar. Why did the Muslims not attempt to conquer France until the Battle of Tours or Poitiers in 732? Was that because there's a massive mountain range there, the Pyrenees, which is difficult to get over? And finally, where did the Rock of Gibraltar even get its name? Geographical names frequently contain rich histories of themselves. You explore why this is named that, or how this thing over here got its name, or you can use Google Maps or 360 photographs online to offer students a great way to see geography they can't visit, or online geography games through National Geographic or other sources can be made into contests or daily exercises for students to boost their knowledge. Learning to geocache or being introduced to orienteering skills, playing certain board games such as Risk or Ubi or any military role-playing games, creating maps of their neighborhood, or reconstructing battle maps using miniatures are all grand activities that yield a much greater sense of the world around them. Now the last two, the sense of historical empathy, and then the final sense, which is the sense of dramatic story, are a little bit more even significant than the first three, I think, because they really spark the imagination of young people. Empathy, which is our ability to feel something of what others go through, is a sense that must be cultivated in the young in all areas. There's a famous line from Ernest Hemingway. He wrote, "The most complicated subject that I know is a man's life. Life is complex, and the motives behind what another person says or does sometimes remain inscrutable until we feel with them what they felt." There's a great scene in the movie A Night to Remember when the Titanic is about to finally plunge into the water and all the people are struggling to escape the disaster. They suddenly accept their fate and they begin together to pray the Lord's Prayer in their own language. That moment creates a sense of the horror and awfulness that they must have faced. And it promotes in us a sense of empathy. Reading Lord's account of that Night to Remember enhances this. The famous scene in Laura Ingalls Wilder's book, The Long Winter, when they have to endure day after day of cold and gray and hunger, grinding away at that grinder in order to grind the grain to have bread, that prompts a sense of what they must have endured, whether we could endure the same thing. The last songs of the Carmelites as they ascended the scaffold for execution in the Lessons to Carmelites, or the account of Robert Lecky's time in the Pacific, or the statement of Chief Joseph, where he says, "I am tired of fighting. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." These first-hand accounts prompt in us a sense that we too could have endured this and may have responded in just the same way. It would be very helpful when cultivating this sense of empathy to engage students in hands-on projects.
Here, for instance, is the second Victory Stela of Kamose. It dates around the 16th century BC and marks Kamose' triumph over the Hyksos and the Kushites. It's very old, but was made in a way that is still accessible today. The original stela was carved into a large slab of stone, but by pressing various carved wooden shapes into a slab of wet clay, and then letting the clay dry or firing it in a kiln, one can reproduce the effect. Constructing a project in which students can make their own stela with clay and shapes is not a bad idea at all. You incorporate it into a larger discussion of writing itself, or of the victory of Kamose, or of warfare in the ancient world. And students have a better idea of what people of that era were engaged in. Their imagination is sparked by creating something very similar to what ancient Egyptians created. Concrete projects that they can take home and be proud of.
Learning to empathize with historical figures, even those who seem to be evil, gives us insight into their motives and the mystery of the human heart. I'm always a little bit angered when people compare someone in our current era to Adolf Hitler. Hitler is frequently a punching bag. He definitely was a very bad character in history. And one could not write him up as a saint, no doubt. But he was a human. And to simply write him off as a monster, I think neglects the fact that he is human and that we might actually go through similar experiences to what he went through. To find out that he suffered through the trench warfare and all that that entails during World War I. Or to find out that he was very proud of his great country, Germany. Or to find out that his intent originally was to try and make Germany a better place. Those begin to hit home and allow us to have at least some empathy with even this man who most people write off as a monster. If one ever gets the chance to see a great movie like Downfall, for instance, you begin to really empathize with this fellow. And it doesn't mean you're going to go out and do the same things he does, God forbid. What it means is that you can actually begin to understand that this guy was a human being, worthy of our pity perhaps, worthy of our prayers. And that given similar situations, we might have similar emotions, similar responses, maybe even similar temptations to disastrous results. Edward Hallett Carr wrote that history is a dialogue between the present and the past. It's a dialogue between the present and the past. I like that very much. The creation of this dialogue can sometimes be initiated simply by walking students through a photograph or a painting. You don't reveal at first what you know about that painting or that photograph, but you do ask questions of the students that might lead them to find out more about the scene.
Look at this painting here, for instance. See the fellow standing in the midst of all that mud. What is he doing there? Is he a soldier? Was there a war? Which war do you think? What details suggest that it might be a modern war? Does the black and white quality of the photograph tell us what era this was? Does the fact that it is a photograph and not a painting tell us anything? What country do you think this man comes from? What country is he in? Why is his head downcast? What are those large pools of water? And why is there no grass and no trees? What do you think this soldier might say to us? How many have heard of the Battle of the Somme? How many have heard of World War I?
Examining history as though it were a dialogue between the present and the past, it grants us knowledge into what other people went through. It's as if to say we are also human beings and cannot escape the fact that we are part of the human race. I remember reading Ambrose Bierce's works, the short stories about the Civil War, and they are macabre, they are very dark. but they are well worth reading for older scholars because they not only give us something of history, but they give us something of a first-hand account of what people went through in that awful conflict. At one point at Cold Harbor, it was described, the conflict was described, that the air was gray with lead. That's how much ordnance was flying through the air. It made the air gray. Imagine that for a minute. And think about those men that cowered in ditches, afraid to lift their heads because the lead was flying everywhere. Learning empathy teaches us that we can be one with others in our current situation. It gives us insight into who we are and allows us to be liberated from the tyranny of godlike illusions. Those are very important things, I think, in history, much more important than simply knowing all the dates and all the names. Now, lastly is the overall sense of dramatic story. British writer Arnold Toynbee believed historical change is driven by challenges and responses. This driving force is referred to as the dialectic. And if you've seen the great Coen brothers movie about Hollywood, Hail Caesar, you will have remember this funny conversation about the dialectic that occurs. The dialectic is a process where two or more parties with vastly different viewpoints conflict with each other and then eventually reach a compromise and mutual agreement. The theory of dialectics was first applied by the philosopher Hegel, George Hegel, in the 19th century. And he suggested that most historical changes and outcomes are driven by dialectic interaction. For every thesis, proposition, or idea, there exists an antithesis, a reaction or opposite idea. Kind of like, I guess, the law of thermodynamics in a way. The thesis and antithesis encounter or struggle with each other, and from which emerges a synthesis, which is a new idea or a new way of living. In drama, on the stage, such dialectic is called conflict. And without conflict, there is no story. The very drama of drama comes from the conflict of opposing forces. Man versus nature, woman versus man versus himself, man versus animal, etc., etc.
Thomas Jefferson, when creating the founding documents of our nation, found himself in constant conflict. His views against slavery put him in conflict with his fellow Virginians, who demanded that no mention of slavery be included in the Declaration or Constitution. His opinions about federalism put him in conflict with his good friend and colleague John Adams. His opinions about freedom put him in conflict with the awesome power of England. His story, therefore, is an extremely exciting story. Reading through his biography by David McCullough, or by John Bowles, or by Christopher Hitchens is well worth the time. But reading through Jefferson's notes on Virginia grants us a first-hand knowledge of the conflict within the man himself. Concerning slavery, Jefferson wrote, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. A revolution of the wheel of fortune is already perceptible. The spirit of the master is abating, that of the slave rising from the dust, preparing, I hope, for a total emancipation."
When we study history, we eventually realize that it's quite a story. Conflict, action, survival, heartbreak, suffering, endurance, triumph, failure. These are all part of a great narrative that sweeps us up and carries us away into a much bigger epic than we can imagine. I hope that this brief discussion helps in some way in your attempt to draw young people into history. Remember that the goal is to spark in them the enthusiasm for this exciting subject. To do that, you keep it simple. 6 senses: characters, cause and effect, chronology, geography, empathy, and story. As always, the ultimate goal is that of self-knowledge and knowledge of the divine. If we do this, we create lifelong learners who will not only know their own history, but will have something to say in this great dialogue of human life. Thanks so much.